So,
Well,
okay, yeah, recording going. One of the other issues is that these plots, they're either 10th acre or 20th acre plots. So that means that there's a radius from the center of either 26.3 feet or 37.2 feet, which when the letters went out to request permission to access properties, it just went to where the plot center was located,
well,
not necessarily to a neighboring parcel where, you know, the plot overlaps. So that's also meant that we need to go and knock on neighbors' doors, or the protocol does allow for estimating trees, and it takes that into account. So there is some of that kind of built in, and that was definitely happened quite a bit in the 2010 data. There's a lot of notes that said, you know, estimated from street or over fence or something like that. So anyway, you know, fortunately, neighbors have been really friendly, and I haven't had, you know, any instances of, you know, people being upset or anything like that. On the flip side, the neighbors have been very friendly. So you know, a lot of people are asking us, you know, what's going on and what are we doing, and asking us about the project, which is great. And I always love talking about trees, but it also adds time to data collection, and the project is just taking longer than I guess I originally anticipated. When I was mostly focused on, okay, what will it take to collect data in these plots. I personally didn't spend as much time thinking about what are the logistical challenges of getting onto people's properties, and, you know, what if these plots spill over onto, you know, over the fence, things like that. So it's still going pretty well. We're able to get like about 3 to 6 plots in a day, depending on all those factors. So the other challenge is, you know, we got kind of a late start, and, you know, didn't have a huge number of plots to choose from. So, you know, the leaves are falling off pretty quickly, but fortunately we're wrapping up data collection efforts more or less next week. So progress to date is we've got of those kind of 44, we've got probably 3/4 of them complete, and there's a handful of plots that have no trees, like, you know, where it's in a lake or in a parking lot or something, where it just need to do a verification, to just, you know, do an on the ground verification. So I think we're on track to finish up those 44 plots by like I said, next week, or if not, you know, the last week in October, you know, to get the last plot. So, you know, progress is good for what we have available, but if we had all, you know, 110 plots to get to, it would have been a push to get done in September and October. So lessons learned, but so that leaves about 62 plots to remeasure from the 2010 data. 7 of those have denied access already from the letter campaign. So that leaves about 55 really. So, and those are just people that didn't respond from that letter writing campaign. But early on, we ended up generating an additional 40 random plots based on the pre-stratification scheme from the original data. So we do have a set of 40 additional plots that haven't, you know, those homeowners haven't been tapped yet. So as Steve mentioned, we've proposed to amend our scope to include some of that additional outreach effort. So that would be, you know, those 40 additional plots plus all of the areas where those plots overlap, identifying all of those parcel numbers and addresses that are associated there, and getting outreach to those homeowners that haven't responded one way or the other. And so I think between those 55 that never responded and those additional 40 plots that we generated, I think we would definitely be on track to match the 2010 inventory, to kind of update that. So the additional scope would include probably an additional letter campaign for all those new plot centers, as well as the existing ones, like a re-outreach to the existing folks that haven't responded, as well as to the neighboring plots where there's overlap, but also following up with some direct outreach efforts, including door knocking and leave behinds, like door hangers, informational flyers, maybe some posters, something to get the community a little bit more aware, and getting more community buy-in. So, and then extending it into the spring of 2023, because we really can't take plot data with leaf-off conditions. One, because tree ID is more challenging, but mostly because a lot of the data that we're collecting involves estimating what percent of the total crown has live branches or dieback, or is shading out other trees. That those things feed into the calculations for things like stormwater runoff or cooling nearby buildings, things like that. So we really do need to collect during leaf on season, not just for tree ID, but all these other data points that we're collecting. So my pitch would be to continue the field campaign into 2023. And I think with dedicated outreach effort over the winter, then, I think we'd be able to secure access to enough plots and have a really good plan to knock out those remaining plots to finish. So that's my update.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So if there's any way that the tree board can help with the media campaign, let us know. One of our board members, Sandy, who couldn't be here tonight, is avidly interested in PR and education around, tree related activities. So, and others on the board too might be able or willing to help out. And hopefully we have an arborist on board soon to work with you guys.
Right. Yeah, that'd be great.
Just one comment. It would be really nice if we could remeasure all the plots we had originally, but if we just remeasure, say, half of them, ultimately, it was always going to be sort of a two-part project anyway. I'm not sure I fully realize that, but really changes from the current situation and then changes from 2010.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the IMAP doesn't do that kind of thing, I'm pretty sure. So you were going to have to write your own software to figure that out anyway. If we just have half the plots remeasured, that would still give us a lot of data on how trees are growing in Lake Forest Park. And then the full suite of plots, including some 40 new plots, as you said, should put us in pretty good shape.
Oh yeah, I think so. Absolutely. Yeah. It's nice to have those plots that you can get to and remeasure, to have some more of a story to tell, like what's happened since the last time you remeasured. But so I'm trying my best to set up a way to have things more remeasurable, because we're not installing fixed plot centers. We're not tagging trees, all the things that you would do in a more formal permanent plot remeasurement scenario like the Forest Service does, right? So
well, and this sort of bleeds into the next agenda item, that one of the things that we've been working with the city council on and revising the tree code is trying to see if we need to adjust the diameter of our most valuable trees, and we wanted to have data from the inventory to see, just what proportion of trees do we capture if we use, say, a 36-inch DVH versus a 42-inch DVH or a 32-inch DVH, right? For trees that we want to particularly protect. And so that won't be dependent on resampling of the original plots, but that's something that we could draw from the whole entire data set.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Anybody have any questions for Drew or any further discussion of the tree inventory? We're looking forward to seeing the data. I mean, this is, we've been working on this now for probably 3 years since you joined the board, huh, Doug? It was, I think, even underway before you came on board, trying to get this redone. So,
Well, yeah. I mean, it'd be great to do it, more regularly, but
well, I think the goal initially was to have it be a 10-year re-inventory, right? So I think the board started working on it about probably 4 years ago, thinking about planning for doing it in 2020. And
yeah,
a lot of things happened that intervened, like a pandemic. So
absolutely.
put us off, but we're looking forward to the results.
Me too.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Drew.
Yeah. Yep. Thank you.
The next agenda under old business item is the tree code amendments update. And I alluded to that just now about, some of the recommendations we had made to the council with respect to the tree code have been adopted, and others were sort of put on hold until we had the results of the inventory. I don't think there's any updates for us on this regard. Larry, has there been any discussion of this subsequently in the council?
Yes, there's not really any new information. The council's also eager to see the data and to get some recommendations from the tree board regarding recommended diameter sizes. There were a few other smaller topics that I think maybe clarifying the definition of grove, things like that there was some confusion, but we wanted to make sure we adopted as much of the changes as we could at that time. So just a couple of other, little things to just kind of clarify from the tree board.
And those things probably we can just wait until we have the inventory and can bring whatever other sets of changes are needed at one time. Is that how you prefer to go?
I think so. Yeah, I think by far the biggest remaining change will be tree diameters and also species. So of the list of species that are currently candidates for protected status, should other species be added? Should some species be removed? But I think this is all information that we'll get from the inventory data.
Yes, that's a good reminder. That's probably something we should put on the agenda for the tree board for a discussion at a future meeting, is to consider the notion of whether other species should be designated for minimum size changes or size protections. Right now, it's Drew. I guess you're probably the one who's may not be aware of the details, but it's mostly native species that are the ones that we have specified. But there are some other species not native that are spectacular trees. So whether we want to just have minimum sizes generally, regardless of species, or whether we want to continue to identify individual species that we're concerned about.
Mr. Chair, Steve Dunn. There was an additional change after the council adopted the set of recommendations from the tree board. I don't know, Councilmember Goldman, if you want to talk about that, but there was a change to the adding a waiting period for major tree permits. The council, because there was an appeal on one major tree permit, and the appeal was filed, yet there was nothing in the code to stop the applicant from going ahead and doing the tree removal. They agreed not to while the appeal played out. Council felt it necessary to adopt a holding period, a waiting period that corresponded to the appeal period. So that change has been made since the last time you probably talked about the tree. Councilmember, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
And that was part of our motivation for getting this change, the changes passed, because the appeal, the appeal waiting period, that was a time-sensitive change to make. So we wanted to make sure to get that in place, and then we can wait on the data from the inventory to take care of the other items.
Yeah. Well, that was a good one. I'm glad to hear that that was adopted. I remember the conversations around it with respect to that appeal. Thank you. The next item on the agenda is replacement tree plantings. And this was a program that I had proposed, a neighborhood based approach to identifying homeowners that would be interested in having trees to be planted on their property. And I'm afraid I haven't done any further work on that. But that's probably something that would be too late to implement this fall anyways. I think what we should do as a board is figure out how to work with the city to do this with a goal of planting trees maybe a year from now. If we're going to identify a neighborhood, contact homeowners, get a list of who is interested in having trees, find out how much money we have to spend on trees, and figure out whether we're going to offer specific species or how we're going to do that. All is going to take a little bit of planning that we can work on and make that an agenda item for board meetings this winter.
Hey, just one comment. Yeah, one comment on that. We may have a fairly significant chunk of, if I understand correctly, and always possibly don't, we may have a pretty significant chunk of money to spend on that if Sound Transit decides to essentially pay off the cost of the replacement cost of the trees they take out. And if they're taking out, like, I've remember like 500 trees, is that the general? And if they, if they have to pay for planting 500 trees somewhere else in the city, that could give that neighborhood tree program quite a boost.
Yes. And that there was also that big fine for a homeowner that removed several mature Douglas fir trees. I think there was an appeal pending on that. I don't know if I've heard anything about what the city is actually going to get from that, but I think that money goes into our tree planting fund as well.
Right.
Steve, have you heard anything about that?
We are still negotiating with the person who did the tree removal, so that's still to be determined. The actual fines going to be.
Yeah. Oh well. Okay. Well, the next agenda item is the 2022 Arbor Day event, and 2022 is rapidly drawing to a close. The Arborist was working on, we had identified a site where we were planning to plant the tree up on Horizon View Park. We have a tree to plant, which is one that I have in a big pot in my own private nursery. That was a Styrax japonica that would be a nice ornamental medium-sized tree. Excuse me. I'm sorry, I have to take this call. I'm going to go on mute.
Anybody?
Okay, I'm back. My grandson just sprained his ankle at soccer practice, and so my wife's going to go get him. So for the Arbor Day event, I'm not sure what the status is of whether we should pursue that this fall or just roll that into next year's Arbor Day. But that's, that maybe is something our new assistant city planner can work with me on.
What was the last word you heard from Harvey about the Horizon View location?
I thought that this location out near the east side of the park along the street not far from the parking lot was a spot that he had identified that had been approved by whoever he had talked with about that.
Yeah, I can follow up with the public works and the parks folks to see, just to confirm that. So might be able to go ahead and do that. Since it's still October, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, the time to plant trees is going to come up once the rains start. So, if we can make that happen, that would be great. And I can dig up the correspondence I had with Harvey about that and bring you guys up to speed on that. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on your name, new assistant city planner.
Riley.
Brent?
Riley.
Fine. Okay, I'll get in touch with you about that.
Sounds good.
Riley, I'm sorry. Got it.
You got it.
Okay. And the public outreach plan was what Sandy had been working on. She sent me an email or sent an email around saying that she hoped to have a media calendar for December, January, February available for our November meeting. And that she will, once we have content dates, we can have start putting up some information graphics, postcards and so on. And we look forward to having her back and getting that, starting to implement her ideas about that. It's been great to have somebody with such a focus on public outreach on the board. Okay. New business, actually, this was carryover from last time too, the tree board website link updates. That was some changes in links that we had taken care of at the last meeting. I think those changes have been made. I recall there was one inappropriate link that was going to be deleted, and I've forgotten what the other change was, but.
Well, one thing we did is we updated there's a map showing the canopy over the
That's
city.
right.
And we put in the 2016 map instead of the God knows when map, 2009 or 2008 map. So, but that's been taken care of.
Yeah. The other one was a link about trees, and all it did was link to the UW Environment and Forest Resources main page, and that was not appropriate. Okay.
Not helpful.
Yeah, and then the other new business item here was the farmers market booth. And this was also something that we did for the first time last year, and I thought it was very successful, was to have a booth at the last week of the farmers market, or one of the last weeks. And I don't know where we're at with that, but that must be rolling around right about now. I think it's probably too late to make that happen. And Ashley was the draw in that, really, because we advertised that the arborist would be there, and a lot of people came by to ask questions of her. It was a good idea, but I think it's not going to happen this year. Does anybody know, Larry or Steve, when the farmers market actually officially ends?
I don't know exactly.
Yeah. They had approached us last year about whether we would like to have a booth, and it was so successful we wanted to do it again this year, but that was something Harvey was going to look into, and he's not with us anymore.
So the final farmers market is this Sunday, the 16th.
So I guess it's not going to happen for this year, but that's something, I like that idea, and I think we should make it a point to do it again next year. I think that the reason that it was done at the end, they gave us the 2 or 3 weeks that we could choose from, and it was all at the end of the end of the year. And I think, at the end of the year, there are simply booths available because some of the vendors stopped coming probably towards the end. Whereas at peak season, they wouldn't be willing to give us a booth when they can have vendors manning those booths. Okay, well, we're rolling right along through this. Anybody else have anything under new business that they want to bring up or things that they would like us to consider? Okay,
Just, oh,
go ahead.
hello. Yeah, just real quick. Just wanted another update from Sandy and Marty and I have been taking a look at the website too, and also just searchability for new residents and how to kind of work on, see what kind of navigating, website navigating changes might be helpful for finding tree information. So kind of just going back to what you were talking about before, we're still kind of looking at that a little bit.
Good. That's something that we've had on our work plan for a long time. And we
Yep.
sort of kept putting it off because there were going to be some changes in the tree code that we wanted
Yep.
to make sure were integrated in the websites, but also the idea of just having the website more functional for the public is a great thing. I'm glad you're working on that.
Yep, sure thing.
Okay. Okay, reports and announcements, Frontlines. This is something that usually the our liaison has some things to tell us about. I'm not sure if there's anything going on or that can be brought up.
I think
Riley.
from
Go ahead.
staff, no, probably not anything new that we haven't already covered.
Okay. Thank you. And then the last is Councilman Goldman. Do you have anything else to give us that you contributed a little bit a minute ago?
Yeah, I can give kind of like 3 quick updates on things. First, just wanted to provide a little bit, but not total clarity on Sound Transit. So in one of their environmental reports, I forget the exact acronym from last year, they estimated about 450 trees and their language was removed or altered. And that's, to me at least, that's fairly vague language in terms of, does it mean cutting the entire tree down? Does it mean pruning one branch? And when the council asked them for clarity at a recent council meeting, they didn't really provide any clarity. They said they would get back to us. We are awaiting that. And so it's really unclear what the magnitude is. I do think we should assume that there's likely going to be a number of trees that are removed. And like you had said earlier, it's likely that rather than them replanting, they're just going to give us a bucket of money to do it ourselves. And so I think if the tree board were to start looking at a plan for where these trees might get replanted, that would be very helpful. Second update, we're in the middle of budget season, where council is currently discussing the budget that the mayor and staff proposed. In terms of things that are, I think, most relevant to the tree board, we touched on increasing hours for the arborist. The other would be providing additional funds to the Watershed company to continue the tree inventory into next year. I don't recall really hearing any objections to either of those, and so I imagine those will both make it into the budget. Can't promise that officially because deliberations are ongoing, but it seems likely in my opinion. And then the third, this is when I was chatting with Councilmember Furutani on, I think this kind of bridges the tree board, the parks board, and the climate action committee. In the tree board, you talk a lot about native trees and the value of native trees in the area. And Councilmember Furutani and I were talking about other plants, in particular grass and lawns. And might there be value? This is something that California is doing. They're basically paying people to rip up their lawns and replace it with more drought tolerant native ground cover. And might this be something that the tree board, or if it's for some of our parks, the parks board, or it's climate related, the climate board, might there be interest in sort of extolling the virtues of native ground cover in addition to the virtues of native trees? And so I just wanted to bring that to your attention and just, I see if that was something that was of interest to the board. But then I think that's those are updates for me.
Thank you. with respect to that, the latter, I mean, living in Western Washington, as we do, native ground covers typically exist under tree canopies. So, you know, how we'd have open ground that's landscaped other than lawn, and trying to use natives would be, you know, I'm sure there's ways we could do that. It'd be something worth looking into to see what there is we could do about that. So, all right,
Probably the main thing you can do, of course, is encourage people to just let their lawns go brown in the summer.
that's true.
I mean, none of it's native, but there aren't going to be native lawns.
Yeah, and the most important thing is to stop using pesticides and herbicides on lawns, to just keep it as a monoculture of grass, because the insect and invertebrate fauna, you know, suffers, and that increased diversity, plant diversity in a lawn helps make it more resilient to things like fluctuations in weather and climate. Getting the idea across that dandelions are okay is going to be a little hard for some people, but you know, that's what we need. And clover and things like that, which has the capacity to enrich the soil through nitrogen fixation. Yeah, okay. Thank you, Councilmember Goldman. The next, our last item is the agenda for next meeting. Does anybody have anything they specifically want to have on the agenda next month?
Well,
If you-
the
go
point you were
ahead.
making earlier about what we want to look for our tree protection in terms of, say, native trees or non-native trees.
Yeah,
I would like to have that be a fairly major item sometime before we get the inventory data. Because it would
yes,
be nice if we had already done some of the thinking about, you know, well, do we care if the trees are native? For a great many reasons, we don't care if they're native.
Yep.
So at some point, I'd like that to be an agenda item sometime when there's not much else going on. And I don't know if that's next month or not.
yeah. Well,
I
good.
think that
That,
would be a good thing to do in person. So it just feels like a thing we should actually be discussing rather than.
yeah, and the other thing I want to work on over the next few months is that coming up with a plan for tree replacement. It sounds like we are going to have funding to plant a lot of trees, and it would really be a great time to integrate, you know, some of Sandy's ideas about education and outreach to get people on board with planting trees in their own yards, and we can provide them with the trees and some expertise for how to do that, and start with, you know, a neighborhood that could use more trees. Yes, Drew.
Yeah, I was just wanted to add too, because in our original pitch about doing this work, I incorporated doing some remote sensing analysis, so including the most recent LiDAR data. I know the city of Lake Forest Park has had canopy cover analyses done, so that's not exactly what I'm proposing, but using the plot level data and tying it to LiDAR data as well as other remote sensing data like satellite imagery, and trying to see, now I'm not promising anything, I'm just more curious for myself, but also trying to see if we can do some inference across the city, right? Because there's inherent limitations to this plot sampling effort, right? Like you're just gonna miss some of the biggest trees across the city. It's a representative sample across the city, but it's not a complete inventory. And just because of the randomized nature of the location of the plots, you're gonna miss some interesting things. So I am hoping to tie some of the plot data to LiDAR data, and then, you know, if we have enough plots, project that out and infer some statistics across the city. And so we can, obviously iTree does that just with the plot level data, but then seeing if we can get some more robust analysis using other remote sensing techniques too. So I don't know if that was conveyed or not, but that was something, I don't know how well it's going to work, but I'm pretty curious to see how that performs and what kind of information we'll get from that. So.
Well, there's something vague, Larry, you can correct me if you don't think it's vague, but something quite vague in the current code that says we need to redo the canopy cover analysis every 5 years. And I think Larry and I have talked about that, and we can't entirely figure out what the code even means right now. But there are new LiDAR data since the last time the canopy was analyzed. And so it's not a ridiculous thing to do to reanalyze the canopy data in the same way we've done it before, or it's been done before. Now, if we could augment that and get some more really cool stuff out of it, that'd be great. But I'm just partly telling you, Drew, and reminding other people that a redo of the LiDAR data, a redo of the LiDAR analysis is something that we think the city code says we're supposed to do.
And I can add on to that. That was another item that came up in our deliberations. And we kind of just ran out of time because we really wanted to get the appeals process ironed out. And so that's something else, if the tree board can provide us with a bit of clarity on what is the intention. And then once we kind of know what the intention is, then let's make sure it's worded in a way that is comprehensible and gets at that.
So that's maybe another agenda item at some point, to look at that language and see if we can figure out what it means. And if we agree with what it means, clarify, because I honestly don't know. And I looked at it pretty hard. So.
All right, thank you. Well, we've come to the end of our agenda. And so if I hear a move to adjourn, we can take off early tonight. Doug moves to adjourn, second. Somebody. Thank you, Marty, second. All in favor? Show of hands. Okay, we're adjourned. Next meeting will be on November 2nd. See you guys then.
Thank
Thank
you.
you all for coming.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Drew.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a good night and welcome to the city, Riley.
Yes, welcome, Riley. I'll be in touch with you before the next board meeting for sure.
Sounds good. All right, good night.